The courtroom in Philadelphia's county courthouse buzzed like a beehive. Journalists scribbled frantically, cameras clicked, and the jury, mostly retirees who grew up on Robert De Niro's films, sat with tense faces. The sweltering July of 2025 had brought a scandal that shook America. Robert De Niro, a Hollywood legend, stood trial on charges of fraud. His charitable foundation, which supported young artists from underserved neighborhoods, was branded a front for money laundering. The press devoured the story, churning out headlines like De Niro, genius or criminal? At the center of the courtroom, behind the defense table, sat De Niro himself. No lawyer, just him, in a dark suit that hung slightly loose on his lean frame. His gray hair was neatly combed, but his eyes, those piercing eyes from Taxi Driver, burned with quiet, unshakable resolve. At 81, he'd chosen to defend himself, shocking everyone from reporters to the judge. Judge Edward K. Russell, a 67-year-old veteran with a silver mane and a steely gaze, made no effort to hide his disdain. To him, De Niro was just another rich man who thought fame could buy freedom. Russell loathed celebrities, seeing them as spoiled show-offs. Today, he was determined to crush this Hollywood icon. Mr. De Niro, Russell's voice boomed, cutting through the creak of the ceiling fan. Do you understand that you face up to 7 years in prison? Yes, Your Honor, De Niro replied, his New York accent clear, his tone calm but firm. And I'm here to prove my innocence. The room erupted in whispers. Russell slammed his gavel, demanding silence. His eyes narrowed. This isn't a movie set, Mr. De Niro. There are no retakes here. De Niro nodded, his face betraying no emotion. But inside, adrenaline surged through his veins. He knew this wasn't just a trial. It was a war for his name, his legacy. And he wasn't going to lose. Prosecutor Emily Crow, young and ambitious, stood to present the charges. Her voice sliced through the air like a blade. Mr. De Niro created a foundation meant to help young people, but instead, he funneled millions to offshore accounts. This isn't charity, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, it's a crime. She called her first witness, a financial expert, who displayed complex charts of transactions. The room drowned in numbers, but the message was clear. De Niro's foundation looked like a scheme. The jury frowned, struggling to follow. Russell nodded, his face impassive. When it was De Niro's turn, he rose slowly. The room fell silent. He approached the witness, holding only a thin folder. His steps echoed in the hush. Mr. Expert, De Niro began, his voice low but piercing. You said these transactions had no explanation. Did you review the contracts the foundation signed with art schools in Colombia? The expert hesitated. No, we didn't have access to those documents. So you accused me, without checking all the facts? De Niro clarified, his eyebrow slightly raised. Crow leapt up. Objection. These documents weren't provided. Because you didn't ask for them, De Niro shot back calmly, turning to the judge. I can provide copies. Russell's lips tightened. He hated surprises in his courtroom. But the documents looked legitimate. He allowed them to be admitted, though his glare at De Niro grew colder. That evening, Philadelphia buzzed. In bars and at kitchen tables, older folks who remembered Raging Bull and Cape Fear debated the case. He's still got fight in him, said 65-year-old Frank, a retired firefighter, sipping a beer. But Russell will eat him alive, his wife replied. The next day, the tension in the courtroom escalated. A new witness, a former foundation accountant, claimed De Niro had ordered him to hide transactions. Could De Niro hold his ground? Would his defense crumble? The room waited, holding its breath. The morning of the third day dawned gray and heavy. Dark clouds hung over Philadelphia, and the air in the courtroom felt thick with tension. The scent of old wood and floor wax mingled with the faint aroma of coffee sipped by journalists crowding the back rows. Robert De Niro sat at the defense table, his posture straight, but his face etched with the lines of a sleepless night. Before him lay a neat stack of documents, beside a glass of water he barely touched. His eyes, however, remained sharp as a blade, scanning everyone who entered the room. Judge Edward K. Russell took his seat, his face sterner than ever. He didn't bother hiding his irritation. De Niro, this Hollywood upstart, had twice made him question the prosecution's case, and it grated on him. Russell prided himself on his reputation as a fair but unyielding judge who gave no quarter to celebrities. To him, this trial was about more than the law. It was about principle. The rich and famous should not stand above justice. Prosecutor Emily Crow, dressed in an impeccable gray suit, looked confident, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. De Niro's performance yesterday had shaken her strategy, and she knew today she had to land a decisive blow. Her key witness was Paul Martinez, the former foundation accountant, a nervous man with a shaky smile and trembling hands, who claimed De Niro had personally ordered him to manipulate financial reports. "Mr. Martinez," Crow began, her voice clear and sharp as a lock clicking shut, "tell the jury what Mr. De Niro asked you to do with the foundation's financial records." Martinez cleared his throat, his eyes darting between the prosecutor and the jury. He told me to redirect funds to certain accounts without listing them in the reports. Said it was for special projects, but I knew it was wrong. The room buzzed. Journalists whispered, and the jury, mostly older folks who'd grown up on De Niro's films, exchanged looks of shock and disappointment. One woman, 68-year-old Ellen, who'd seen The Godfather Part 2 in theaters with her late husband, pursed her lips. She wanted to believe in De Niro, but Martinez's words sounded convincing. De Niro sat motionless, his fingers faintly tightening around a pen. He didn't look away from the witness, but there was no anger or fear in his gaze, only calm, almost predatory focus. When his turn came, De Niro rose slowly. The room froze. He approached the witness, holding just one sheet of paper. His steps echoed in the silence, like the ticking of a clock. "Mr. Martinez," he began, his voice low, but cutting through like a whisper in the dark, "you said I ordered you to hide transactions. Can you give the date and place where this happened?" Martinez faltered, his fingers trembling. "It was in your office, I think, last spring." "Last spring," De Niro repeated, his brow slightly raised. "Mr. Martinez, I was in London from February to April, shooting a documentary about urban artists. Here are my plane tickets and hotel receipts." He placed the sheet before the witness. "Care to take a look?" The room erupted in whispers. Crow jumped up. "Objection, Your Honor. This wasn't disclosed in advance." "They're public records, Ms. Crow," De Niro replied calmly, turning to the judge. "I can provide copies." Russell slammed his gavel, his face reddening with restrained anger. "Enough theatrics, Mr. De Niro. The documents are admitted, but watch yourself." De Niro nodded, but his gaze lingered on the judge for a moment. It wasn't a challenge, but a quiet reminder. He wouldn't back down. Then he turned back to Martinez. "Mr. Martinez," he continued, his tone softening, almost sympathetic, "did someone pressure you to give this testimony? Maybe offer you something? I'm not accusing, I just want to understand." Martinez suddenly paled. His eyes darted, and he looked down. "No, no one pressured me," he mumbled, but his voice shook. The jury noticed. Ellen, seated in the front row, leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. She'd been a schoolteacher for 30 years and could spot a lie a mile away. Something about Martinez wasn't right. Crow quickly intervened, trying to salvage the moment, but the damage was done. De Niro returned to his seat, his face impassive, but the room felt a shift. The jury began to doubt, and journalists scribbled furiously. De Niro dismantles prosecution witness. That evening, the news replayed snippets of the hearing. In a Philadelphia suburb, 62-year-old Tom Kelly, a Vietnam vet, sat in his living room, holding a beer. His wife, Marge, a 60-year-old retired nurse, watched the TV with him. "He's not backing down," Tom said, nodding at the screen showing De Niro leaving the courthouse, ignoring camera flashes. "Like in Cape Fear. Remember how he fought to the end?" "But the judge hates him," Marge replied, frowning. And that accountant? Something's off. He's lying like a drunk driver at a checkpoint. Meanwhile, in his rented downtown apartment, De Niro sat at a table piled with papers. His daughter, Drina, called from New York. "Dad, you shocked them today," she said, her voice full of pride but tinged with worry. "But they won't stop. The prosecutor's planning something big." "I know," De Niro replied, his voice quiet but firm. "But I'm not fighting for me. I'm fighting for those kids who believed in my foundation." He hung up and looked out the window. Philadelphia's lights twinkled like distant stars. He thought of the young artists his foundation supported. 17-year-old Jose from the Bronx, who painted murals about his community. 19-year-old Alicia from South Philly, whose paintings hung in local galleries. If he lost, their dreams would be crushed. That thought fueled him. The next day, the courtroom saw a new witness, a twist that threatened everything. Crow called Lisa Weil, a former foundation manager, who claimed to have evidence of De Niro's direct orders to falsify reports. While a middle-aged woman with a cold stare spoke confidently, presenting emails she said came from De Niro himself. "Here's an email from Mr. De Niro," she said, holding up a printout. "It instructs to redirect funds to an unlisted account." The room gasped. The jury froze, and Russell leaned forward, his eyes glinting. This was the moment Crow had waited for. But De Niro, instead of panicking, stood and requested to question the witness. "Your Honor," he said, his voice calm but resonant with strength, "may I ask Ms. Well a few questions?" Russell nodded, though his eyes were skeptical. De Niro approached the witness, holding only his laptop. "Ms. Weil," he began, "you said this email is from me. Are you aware that every email from my official account has a digital signature? Here's a report from my email system." He opened the laptop and showed the screen. "This email has no signature. It's forged." Weil paled. Crow objected, but her voice lacked conviction. Russell ordered the evidence verified, but the room felt the shift. The jury, especially Ellen, looked at Weil with suspicion. De Niro returned to his seat, but before sitting, he looked at Weil and said softly, "I don't hold grudges, but the truth always comes out." Those words struck the room. Ellen, among the jurors, felt her heart tighten. She remembered her son, a teacher at a school for underserved kids, talking about De Niro's foundation funding their art club. Maybe he really is who he says he is, she thought. The hearing ended early that day for evidence verification. But the city was abuzz. On social media, people shared clips of De Niro's performance, and in local bars, retirees debated. "He's not just an actor," said 70-year-old Joe, a former union leader. "He knows how to fight, like we did in the 70s for workers' rights." The final day of the trial was the climax. Crow called another witness, but De Niro dismantled her arguments again, using detailed records and irrefutable facts. His knowledge of the foundation's financial workings stunned everyone. He wasn't just an actor. He'd studied every detail of his organization for years. Even Russell, despite his bias, began to see him differently. When it came time for closing statements, De Niro stood, his voice quiet but piercing everyone in the room. "I'm not a saint," he said. "I've made mistakes. But my foundation isn't a scheme. It's hope for kids who have nothing but dreams. You may not believe in me, but believe in them." He turned to the jury, his eyes meeting Ellen's. "The truth doesn't need fame. It just needs a chance." The room fell silent. Even Russell, who'd prided himself on his steadfastness, felt a stir of something like respect. The jury deliberated. Hours dragged on, and Philadelphia waited. Finally, they returned. Ellen, now jury foreperson, announced the verdict, not guilty. The room erupted in applause, but De Niro only nodded, his face calm. He thanked the jury and left the courthouse, ignoring reporters' shouts. Russell remained at his bench, watching De Niro go. For the first time in years, he felt he might have been wrong. He didn't say it aloud, but his gaze had softened. That evening, De Niro stood on his apartment balcony, looking at the city lights. His foundation was saved, but the fight wasn't over. Ahead lay new challenges: rebuilding trust, helping kids, confronting those who tried to destroy him. But he knew, one small step, his calm, confident battle in court, had already changed something. Not just for him, but for those who believed in justice. In the suburbs, Tom and Marge sat before their TV, watching De Niro announce a new program for young artists. "He did it," Tom said, smiling. "Like the old days." "And it's just the beginning," Marge added, her eyes shining. Philadelphia exhaled after the verdict. The city's evening streets pulsed with life. Cars honked, passers-by laughed, and neon signs from cafes and bars reflected in puddles after a brief rain. The courtroom, where tension had reigned hours earlier, was now quiet. Only a janitor mopped the floor, the scent of lemon cleaner mingling with the smell of old wood. The not guilty verdict echoed in news, social media, and dinner table conversations across America. Robert De Niro, a cinematic legend, hadn't just survived a legal battle. He'd forced the nation to reflect. What is truth in an age of scandals and prejudice? De Niro sat in his modest rented apartment downtown. The windows were open, and a light breeze carried the smell of wet asphalt and distant car horns. On the table before him lay an old photo, him with young artists at their exhibition opening in the Bronx 2 years ago. Smiles, paint-stained hands, pride in their eyes. That picture had been his anchor throughout the trial. He poured a glass of water, his hands faintly trembling from exhaustion, but his eyes burned with quiet resolve. The battle was over, but he knew this was just the beginning. The trial had changed everything. The press, which had called him a fraud a week ago, now wrote of a triumph of justice. Journalists begged for interviews, but De Niro refused. He didn't want fame, just the chance to continue his work. His foundation, though battered by reputational damage, had a shot at revival. But more important was what happened in the hearts of those who followed the trial, especially the older generation who'd grown up on his films. In a cozy suburban Philadelphia living room with a worn couch and an old TV, 62-year-old Tom Kelly and his wife Marge celebrated De Niro's victory with glasses of homemade lemonade. On the screen, a report showed the foundation announcing a new program for young artists from underserved areas. "He didn't just win," Tom said, his voice trembling with excitement. "He showed you can fight without shouting or fists. Like we did in the 70s, picketing for workers' rights." "And that Judge Russell," Marge added, her eyes gleaming. "Did you see how he looked at Bobby at the end? Like an equal." Ellen, the 68-year-old juror who'd become foreperson, sat in a cafe near the courthouse. She held a cup of herbal tea, the scent of mint calming her. Ellen was still thinking about the trial. She recalled the moment De Niro looked at her during his closing statement, his words about kids who believed in dreams. It had struck her. Her son, a teacher at a school for underserved kids, had talked about De Niro's foundation funding their art club. He wasn't lying, she thought. And we did the right thing. Ellen decided to write De Niro a letter, thanking him for his resilience, but for now she just smiled, warmed by the thought that justice had prevailed. Meanwhile, Judge Edward K. Russell sat in his office, where the air smelled of old books and leather. The case file on De Niro lay on his desk, untouched. For the first time in 30 years on the bench, he felt he might have been wrong. His prejudice, his hatred of celebrities, his belief they were all the same, had clouded his judgment. De Niro hadn't just won the case. He'd made Russell question his own blindness. The judge wouldn't admit it aloud, but that evening, as he walked home, he stopped at a newsstand and bought a biography of De Niro. Maybe it's time to learn who he really is, he thought. The next day, De Niro visited a small art studio in South Philadelphia, funded by his foundation. The studio was modest, peeling paint on the walls, the smell of turpentine and acrylic, the sounds of laughter and quiet chatter. In the center stood 19-year-old Alicia, whose paintings had recently been displayed in a local gallery. She nervously clutched a paintbrush when she saw De Niro. "Mr. De Niro," she said, her voice trembling, "I thought you wouldn't come after everything." De Niro smiled, his wrinkles deepening, but his eyes warm. "Alicia, I promised I'd be here. And I keep my word." He walked through the studio, talking to each student. Jose, a 17-year-old from the Bronx, showed him a sketch for a new mural, a vibrant piece about community unity. De Niro listened intently, asked questions, cracked jokes. To these kids, he wasn't a Hollywood star or a defendant. He was someone who believed in them. "You didn't give up," Jose said as De Niro prepared to leave. "Even when everyone was against you." De Niro paused, his expression serious. "You know, Jose, sometimes it feels like the whole world's against you. But if you know what you're fighting for, you find a way. Not with shouting or fists. With your mind and heart." Those words stayed with Jose. That night he worked on his mural, adding a small detail in the center, a silhouette of a man standing tall, a symbol of resilience. Weeks passed. De Niro's foundation slowly rebuilt its reputation. New donations came in, including from people who'd followed the trial and believed in his mission. De Niro hired new managers to avoid past mistakes, but stayed at the heart of the work, reviewing every document, every project. He didn't want anyone to use his dream against him again. One evening, on his apartment balcony, De Niro received a letter. It was from Ellen, the juror. She wrote about her son, about the kids his foundation had saved, and how his calm confidence in court had changed her view of justice. "You reminded me," she wrote, "that truth doesn't shout. It just is." De Niro folded the letter and looked at Philadelphia's lights. He didn't feel euphoria, as others might have thought. Instead, a quiet warmth spread through his chest, the sense that one small step, taken in that courtroom, had already begun to change the world. Not just for him, but for Alicia, Jose, Ellen, and maybe even Judge Russell. In the suburbs, Tom and Marge watched a report about a new exhibition organized by De Niro's foundation. Alicia's paintings glowed on the screen, and Jose gave an interview about his mural. "He did it," Tom said, his voice full of pride. "Like the old days, when people fought for something real." "And it's not over," Marge added, smiling. "It's just the start." De Niro knew challenges lay ahead. The world doesn't change overnight, and the prejudices he'd faced hadn't vanished. But he also knew that every mural, every painting, every saved dream was a step forward. And as long as there were people ready to listen, ready to believe, the journey was worth it. He raised his glass of water, as if in a quiet toast to those who don't give up. To the kids, the jurors, Philadelphia. To the truth which, as he'd proven, always finds its way.